Good morning, everyone. You know, Americans are still asking, where are the jobs? And as the so-called Obama recovery turns 5 this week, I think it's worth assessing where we are. Simply put, the president's recovery is the worst economic recovery in the president's own lifetime. Record number of people are unemployed or have left the workforce. More have left the workforce than have found new jobs. Incomes for American families have declined under this president, while the cost of everything from gas to groceries has gone up. We can do better. Republicans are listening to the American people, and we're focused on jobs. This week, we're sending more jobs bills to the Democrat-controlled Senate. I think it's time for the president to break the Senate gridlock so we can deliver more solutions to middle-class American families. I'm going to thank Kay Granger and Hal Rogers for putting together some thoughtful recommendations on how to address the humanitarian crisis at the border. We're continuing to discuss these issues with our members and looking at those recommendations. But the process has been hampered by the contradictory messages being sent by the White House about the president's willingness to solve the problem. You know, the administration started earlier this month by signaling some openness to changes in the 2008 law to accelerate the process of returning these children to their home countries. The president called for this change, Secretary of Homeland Security called for this change, and other administration officials have called for this change. Now the president and his team have apparently flip-flopped. Now they want billions in new spending with no commitment to actually solving the problem. And we see a similar situation with the scandal at the VA. Bipartisan, bicameral negotiations were making good progress until the White House began demanding more money with no accountability and no strings attached. I want to be clear. There's going to be no blank check for the president and his allies. Some in Washington may view every new crisis as an opportunity to demand more taxpayer dollars. But the American people don't see it that way. They want solutions. And I'm still hopeful that common ground can be found, but common ground must start by listening to the American people. And a force between the priorities of the Democrat-controlled Washington and the priorities of the American people, my colleagues and I will stand with the American people every time. Questions?
The working group hasn't put legislation out yet. Their plan is very different from the Senate plan. There's about 6 legislative days left. Is it safe to say at this point that Congress probably won't be able to strike a deal on legislation to deal with this immigration crisis before you all go home for a month?
Well, we're continuing to talk to our colleagues, and those conversations are going to continue today and again tomorrow. But understand that it's time for the White House to get their act together. Do they want to change the 08 law and address the real underlying problem here, or don't they?
Mr. Speaker, how can you explain the breakdown in the negotiations between the House and the Senate on the VA bill? This looks like one more thing that may slip through the cracks before you leave.
Well, I thought we were making great progress, and frankly, I'm still hopeful that we can get this resolved. But the White House rolls in with a request for $13.6 billion of new money, not very clearly outlined, no hearings, no nothing, and expect us to just add it to this conference report. We're not going to do that.
But how could something that was so agreed upon, that was a crisis that needed to be resolved, how could we be, a month after the fact and still no resolution on this? What responsibility do you all bear on that?
Listen, our members have been working with our Senate colleagues in a bipartisan, bicameral way, and I remain hopeful that we'll be able to resolve this.
Mr. Speaker, whether or not the President supports changing the 2008 law and whether or not he flip-flopped, the House could still pass a bill to change the law and try and force the Senate's hand and force the White House to at least discuss why they wouldn't sign it. So where are you guys in doing that, and will you do it before you leave?
We're going to continue to talk to our members. I think I've been pretty clear that I think taking some action to solve this problem is in order. I think dealing with the humanitarian crisis on the border is also in order. And I've frankly been clear with my colleagues about it.
Thank you, sir. Regardless of what happens on the border issue, do you think the House will vote before the recess on more money for Iron Dome?
I'm not sure where that issue will come up. It's actually a 2015 a spending issue, likely to be dealt with in a continuing resolution that I expect at this point would happen in September.
Mr. Speaker, though, you talk about the VA issue, you talk about the problem in trying to solve the border issue here, though. To what level, though, and you cast a lot of this on the White House in the past few minutes, to what level is your conference responsible? You have a certain number of people in your conference who don't want to spend money. It seems like both of these issues with the VA and the border come down to money, where you have conservatives and Tea Party loyalists who just don't want to go there. What responsibility do you guys bear?
Well, listen, we're working diligently to get to an agreement on the VA. We believe that those veterans who've been waiting in lines, those veterans who live more than 40 miles from a VA facility, ought to have access to care, and ought to have access to care now. Secondly, I think we need to understand how sick this patient is. And I'm talking about the Veterans Administration. We've got a systemic failure of an entire department of our government. And I think understanding just how sick this patient is critically important before we start doing what Washington usually does. And that's just throw money at the problem, throw money at the problem. And so let's do what needs to be done quickly. And I'm remain hopeful. Now, when it comes to the border, let me go back. This is a problem of the president's own making. And then he says he wants to solve the problem so that we can stop this influx, but then he changes his mind. We've got a president that's AWOL. And the president ought to get engaged in this if he actually wants something to happen.
There have been a number of Republicans criticizing President Obama for going on a fundraising swing on the West Coast while everything is happening in the world, including, the down plane and issues in the Middle East. Do you agree? Do you feel like President Obama should not be fundraising while things like this are happening?
Well, maybe he ought to just reorganize his priorities. Deidre.
I want to ask you a question about the debate over the FAA's decision to ban flights temporarily into Israel. They've reversed their decision, but there's been some discussion about why they changed their mind and whether politics was involved. What did you think of the initial decision by the FAA, and why do you think they changed?
I don't know enough about the facts of why they put the ban in place. Clearly, they have a responsibility to keep Americans safe, and if they believed it was too dangerous to fly in there, they might be doing their job. But I don't know enough about the facts to know whether their decision was right or wrong.
Speaker Boehner, Chairman Ryan has given a speech today on poverty. How important is addressing poverty for your midterm message, and how much are you going to embrace his recommendations today?
Well, I've not seen all of his recommendations, but I think having an honest discussion about the problem of poverty is critically important to the future of our country. And Paul Ryan has spent an awful lot of time on this subject, and I'm anxious to hear what he's got to say. But I think everyone in this Capitol wants to help those that are in need. But there's probably a debate about what that help looks like.
You talked about jobs being an issue, but immigration has pushed jobs out of the number one issue for most Americans in a number of polls. If you're coming up on an election, a lot of your members seem genuinely concerned about the inability to do something, at least on the border, as they go home, and are voicing that concern. How big of a political issue would that be if this, what you termed a humanitarian crisis, continues into the summer months before the election?
Well, I think it needs to be resolved. That's why we're continuing to talk to our members about how to resolve it. But as I said before, the White House needs to get its act together, or it's not going to get resolved. And frankly, I think it needs to be resolved.
Earlier this week, President Obama signed an executive order that bans discrimination against LGBT employees and federal contractors. Do you have any response to that?
Nope. President signs a lot of executive orders.
Do you support him extending those protections to the LGBT community?
Listen, the president's going to make his decisions. He can.
You only have a handful of legislative days in September before the government funding expires. Chairman Rogers is already talking about bringing up the CR. Do you expect to vote on one before you leave for the August recess? And how long of a CR would you like to see?
I think I've already answered the question. I expect we're going to do a CR next month, and I would imagine it would go into early December.
Early December.
Thanks, Mr. Speaker. Is it fair to say at this point that the House Republicans will not be putting forward for a vote a sort of comprehensive Obamacare alternative before the election?
You know, the discussions about Obamacare and what the replacement bill will look like continue, trying to build consensus around one plan. Not there yet. Yes.
Wanted to ask you, Senator Ted Cruz has been meeting with some of the House Republicans about immigration, specifically the funding request that the president has given. He wants to see DACA funding stopped, and I guess I'm interested in what impact that has had on the caucus in terms of trying to get them to some kind of consensus.
I'm focused on the recommendations of our border control working group, and we're operating within those guidelines. Thanks.